Good afternoon. My name is Stéphane Mercure. I'm the Director of Performance Analytics and Evaluation at the CFI. Most of you probably know at least one member of my team because each of them is responsible to oversee at least I would say 4 to 5 MSIs. So you've all probably dealt with one of them at some point, especially in the review of annual reports. So I have Tomoka here. I have Sammy in the back. Martin. Patrick is probably somewhere. Yes, there. And there's also Tushika who helped us. So she's an analyst in our team, and she helped us with the presentation I will make of reports that we've worked on recently. So I'll probably speak about PAE. So PAE is our team. So sorry about the use of acronym. We're pretty good at that at the CFI. And also I'll try to use as much as possible national research facilities. But I'm pretty much used to using MSIs by now, so it might change over. So objectives of the presentation today, it's pretty much to first share our experience in using the MSI annual and final reports to demonstrate the value and impact of national research facilities. I will highlight some of the results of our analysis. I will point out some of the challenges we had with the information we're collecting right now from MSIs and RFs. We will propose some ways forward in terms of mitigating the challenges that we've encountered. And finally, we'll open the floor for a discussion. And Tomoka will be here also on the stage to help me with those questions, probably. So some context. There is a growing interest, I have to admit, within and outside the CFI to provide evidence of value or return of investments. And when I say that, it's true for pretty much all our funds. But for sure, if you think about it, just the MSIF, it represents about 25% of our investments every year. We're talking about $100 million going to the MSIs. So it's a significant investment, and we get lots of questions about you folks from our stakeholders. There's also certainly an interest within the CFI right now to demonstrate value and return on investments, especially with the MRF framework. And in terms of our stakeholders, so we get more and more requirements, I would say, also from federal government. After all, they're providing the money. So ensure proper use of funds, which is being discussed right now upstairs, and also to demonstrate the performance and impact of the facilities and our investments in those facilities. And PAE is mostly responsible with the MSI team to do the review of your annual reports, and on our side, use the data we get out of you. And when I say data, I mean quantitative data, so the KPIs, as well as the qualitative data that you provide in your report. So the information is also used for sure for advocacy. And when I say advocacy, it's mostly to be able to demonstrate the relevance, continued need of NRF funding. And we use the KPI and the KPI data and the narrative that we collect through your reports to be able to demonstrate the value. And it's our main source. There are the financial reports, but for sure, when we need to talk about your outcomes, your impacts, the annual reports is the main source of information we have. So whenever we get requests to demonstrate the value, it comes from those reports. We might turn to you to get more information, but at least it's our first source of information. I won't go through this. It's just a little bit of a reminder of what kind of data currently we collect through our annual reports. So we basically have 9 common KPIs that we collect or try to collect from everyone. Some of them don't apply to all MSIs, but in general, they do. So those KPIs, they relate to either activities, outputs, outcomes of the facilities. And we also collect narrative that's in another document. So we have an Excel sheet with the KPIs that you provide every year. And we also have the narrative that goes with that, and that also provide additional information. And one of the topic of that is impact. So what have we done recently with the data we collect through the MSI reports? And one thing I want to mention is, because some of you haven't been through the whole reporting process yet. So usually we have annual reports for the first part of the cycle. And at the end of the cycle, we usually generate a report that's a little bit different, because it's a little bit more of a wrap up. So what have you been able to do during the past 6 years, for example? So we will still collect the annual KPI data as usual, but in that final report, there are broader questions on outcomes and impacts. So we've used the final reports that we've received from the past cycle, so the 17-23 cycle, and we've generated a report out of that was published on our website maybe a month ago. And this is a follow-up, in a sense, to a report we had done also on the previous cycle. This is 2012-2017. So this is one of the use that we've been doing with the KPI data that we receive. The other one is a report that I will also talk about a little bit, that will be going to board in March. I know that Sylvain mentioned the upcoming board. So we did a smaller report that's pretty much to show the progress of MSI so far in the current cycle. So we use the data we collected in 24-25, so year 2 of the MSIs, to generate that short report that gives an overview for our board members of the outcomes of MSIs and also activities. So my first example of the data we've been collecting, and sorry about the little lines there, but it was just taken from the report we just generated on year 2 highlights. But at the same time, this was just to show that facility staff, you can see over the first period, so, or at least the previous period, 17-23, has kind of increased steadily. And the proportion between the admin staff and the scientific and technical staff has remained pretty much the same across. And if you look at the current situation, even though the MSI makeup has changed quite significantly between the previous period and current period, we still have that 25%, 75% proportion of admin versus scientific personnel. Users overall, so this is from the last cycle again. So you can see that there was a huge increase in users from the initial time the funding was released in 2017 to 2023. So we went from 36,000 to 60,000 users of the MSIs. Very interesting observation, I guess, from this is you can see that there was a little plateau in the middle, and that's COVID. So that's not too surprising. And one thing also that's interesting is the shift toward data users. So you will see the next slide, but that increase is interesting because of COVID. Probably there was a shift to remote users a little bit more, less on-site users, maybe also more data being made available. So we do see that shift beginning. I have to say that users, if you look at the number of users overall, what's also interesting is the 16 MSI that were considered at that time had 3 times the number of users of everything we see when we receive our regular reporting from the other infrastructure. So for those that know what we call the project progress reports, so we receive 1,500 of them every year, if not more. And just there, that's 3 times the number of users we get from 1,500 PPRs. So this is impressive if you look at the number of users that MSI are getting compared to all other investments that CFI is making. So the current picture is a little bit different. Again, this is based on the current makeup of the MSIF. So it's interesting to see the big shift in terms of data users with the new MSIs. This is mostly due to one, though, I have to admit, or two, but especially one that generates a lot of data user, and it's the biodiversity center. But this, at the same time, it introduces a challenge for us because most of those data users, the MSIs, get, I would say, fully, but sometimes partly non-identifiable data. So they can report on some aspects of those users. Sometimes they cannot at all. So this introduces a huge challenges for us in terms of being able to include that when we dig a little bit deeper and we try to look specifically at sectoral users versus provincial users or things like that, where the numbers don't match anymore because you have data on some, you don't have data on others. So that introduces a huge challenge for us in terms of being able to report the data clearly. Users from Canada. The only thing I want to point out here is the huge increase that we've seen between the previous cycle and current cycle also in Canadian users. There's no total on the right, but the total there is about 78,000 users from Canada. Again, it's linked to the huge increase in data users and data users that are trackable, that we know where they're coming from. But this is a huge increase from, I know the number is small, but it's 26,000 for the last cycle to almost 80,000 right now. And I'll just mention that even though there was a big change, the proportion between the different provinces didn't change much. Um, but what this also points out is the importance of international users, because at the same time, you can see that, yes, there is a huge increase in users from Canada, but at the same time, it's certainly not at the same level as the increase we've seen in users in general, which went from 60,000 users to more than 2 million when you include CBG, so the Biodiversity Center. So for us, this is, again, a challenge in terms of being able to report. HQP, so that was mentioned a lot. So I don't know if you've ever seen those numbers, but the MSI cohort from 1723 contributed to the training of 22,500 HQPs annually. The numbers right now are a little bit lower if you exclude one facility. I think I was about to say a few, but I think it's one. And if you include it, we get to 27,000. So it's about the same number. The reason we did exclude that those was, again, the difference between data users and remote versus on-site user, which was a little bit of a challenge, including it. Research outputs. So there was a significant drop in research outputs when there was that shift from the former MSI cohort to the new one. At the same time, it's still impressive when you look at the number, for example, of publications that are coming out of just 19 MSIs, because 19 MSIs give you about, not half, but a little bit less than half the production that we get from 1,500 also PPRs, so users of infrastructure, but those that get GELF and IF, for example, or Innovation Fund contributions. What I want to point out here is the uniqueness, and this is again a challenge for us, because you can see the huge variation in some of the KPIs when you look across the facilities. So, for example, users, it goes from 1.5 million for one facility to 207 for another. Staff, a little bit the same thing, 255 versus 6 in one facility. So this is a huge challenge for us because sometimes just including an outlier completely changes the makeup of the distribution of users or HQP. And when I said that we excluded, for example, one MSI from the HQP, it's just that the makeup of those HQP was so different from the others that if we were to include it, the proportion of undergrad would just explode versus all the others MSI. So that's the reason why it was excluded from the figure before. So it's a little bit of a challenge for us, that uniqueness. So that's why we're trying sometimes to exclude or to exclude one facility, but at the same time, we're always trying then to have a note that explains that this is due to uniqueness and this is why. But yeah, this is certainly a challenge when it comes to reporting. One other challenge we're having is optimal use. So optimal use, everyone is a little bit different in terms of how they calculate it. And just talking about it for us is almost impossible. So in the end, every time we try, okay, what are we saying about optimal use? And we always get stuck as, okay, our facilities are optimally used. And that's about all we can say. So this is a challenge. At the same time, it's an objective of the fund. So we need to figure out a way to be able to report a little bit better on that one. So KPIs. I know the presentation is supposed to be about going beyond the numbers, but I wanted you to see a little bit how we've been using the data and presenting the data to the outside world. Basically, if you think about it, the 2017-23 report that just came out is on our website. It's open to anyone to look at. But KPI, they're numbers. They don't tell the full story. So for us, when we look at KPIs, we use them for basically two reasons: oversight or reporting. And when I say reporting, it can be within the CFI, it can be to our stakeholders or just to general public. But KPIs, okay, you observe changing a change in user demand from one year to another, or same thing for satisfaction level. Satisfaction level suddenly drops between 2 years. But for us, that's where we need the narrative. We need to be able, when we do, and here I'm talking mostly about the oversight, but when we do the oversight, we need to understand why there are those changes. And remember, you also have aspirational targets. So as much as possible, we want you to be able to explain to us a little bit. And I'm not saying we need a super long paragraph that explains every detail why maybe you didn't reach your target, but we want to get a sense why the target wasn't reached, for example, or it was already reached, because that's what we're seeing quite often right now. So even though we call them aspirational target, we realize now that pretty much everyone has put their target quite low. So even after 2 years, many targets have been reached, and we're wondering a little bit about that, I have to admit. And we would be happy to hear from you about that, on that. But at the same time, that's an observation from looking at the reports. I'll also mention that, for example, the KPIs, don't look at them necessarily as being in a box. Right now, we've tried to put them under one category, but at the same time, depending on what the KPI is about, depending, because if you're talking about outreach, for example, this is an activity for you, but at the same time, it may be an output because you're, I don't know, organizing an event. It's an activity, it's an output at the same time. So anyway, don't put too much attention on where necessarily the KPIs are on this slide. So going beyond the numbers, I spoke a little bit about the so what. So there may be a valid reason sometimes for a change or a variation. Okay, last year our satisfaction level was at 95, this year is at 80. But I don't know, there was a breakdown in one of the equipment. People were unhappy about it, and simply this can explain the fact that satisfaction went down. We don't know that. So please convey that to us when there are significant changes like that from year to year. A staff level, it says nothing about rollover in terms of staff. So we have no clue. Okay, staff level has increased or has decreased, but what is it linked to? Why does this happen? This is always also interesting to know for us. Um, I'll talk about a little bit also examples of activities and achievements. So please highlight. I know we're asking that questions and we're trying to be as clear as possible when we ask for narrative, but at the same time, we don't always get exactly what we hope for. So when you're talking about scientific contributions, yes, you report a number of scientific outputs. So we had this number of publication last year, but please tell us maybe a little bit more, provide a few examples of your scientific contribution. This is helpful to us, especially for reporting later on or for tracking also. I would say the pathway, and I'll come back to that, but the pathway from being able to generate a result to having an impact later on. So for us, that story is important. And if you're able to talk to us about your scientific contributions, your main scientific contributions during a year, that can be very helpful to us. If I don't know if you reported new collaborations or new partnership, choose a few. I like the nature of those partnerships. Talk about what benefit these partnerships could have for your facility. Is it bringing new funds? Is it bringing new users? Is it simply improving your operations because you're sharing best practices? For us, that's important information to have. It at least provides us with leads that we can follow up with you if ever we have a question. For example, I was mentioning more and more stakeholders are turning to us to get information. What's happening with the MSIs? So at the same time, at least providing us with leads. Oh, this could be interesting based on the question we just received. So please provide us a little bit of information for things like that. You may also want to highlight the role of outreach activities in growing your user base or in setting up those new collaborations. It, like I said, doesn't need to be super long or detailed, but at the same time, give us a sense. And like I have at the end of the slide, always keep in mind the pathway. So I know last year we invited Elena from S3 who presented on Pathway to Impact and their process in terms of establishing those pathways for the different outcomes, impact areas of their facilities in Europe. I think it's important to keep that in mind. We know that we're getting to the benefit. This evolves over several years. It's not something that happens the first year. So it's important for us to get a sense how these come about. So I was talking about scientific contribution, but if you can put that into a story, that's great for us. So I don't know, a scientific result, a scientific contribution, winded up generating or putting you on the right path to get a benefit out of that later on. So we need to get that story as much as possible. Yeah, also, I would say that the why this matters is also important. So it's not just about, okay, we've done this, we've transferred it to a company adopted it. If you're able to get a little bit more information in terms of for the company, what's the benefit? So we need as much as possible to get that story. We're not expecting, and that's my comment about more is not necessarily better. It's not like we're expecting 5, 10 stories every year out of the different facilities. If you think about it, if we just get 4 or 5 in total across the entire period of funding, 4 or 5 from each facility, this is 100 stories that we can work with. Uh, we don't need you to try to get 3, 4 stories every year. We prefer that you provide a complete story and something that's very important, and especially if you're able to show that pathway that I guess the results went through to get to adoption and to get to benefits. One thing I'll mention is simple. That came out earlier. Keep it simple. Avoid jargon. Avoid technical terms. I know when we wrote the report, so the 2017-23 report that's now on our website, we worked a lot with the facilities to try to come up with something that's, I guess, digestible for public that they would understand. Sometimes we all have. I'm a scientist by trade, so I'm the same way. So sometimes we get into jargon, we get into details. Same thing when I said earlier, sorry about the acronyms I will use, but at the same time, we have that tendency. But when you're talking to public, you need to keep it simple as much as possible. And I would say even to our stakeholders, they need to understand what this is about. And we're ready to work with you to get it to a level where we feel that this is something we can use. But at the same time, try to keep it simple at first. And the other thing I will add is, especially now, keep in mind the government priorities. So if you can link any of your impacts, benefit to a government priority, that's helpful. That's definitely helpful for us because it's much easier to convey, especially to government. Those are some examples of impact benefits that were taken out of the. It's not sometimes the complete statement that we have in the report. You can look at the report. It's called Investing for Impact. Like I said, it's on our website. You can link to it directly from our homepage. But those were taken from the report. So it's different examples of impacts benefit that we've used. And for most of them, we worked with the facilities to be able to bring it to a level where we felt we could use it. And it was complete enough to show what the benefit is, how the benefit came about, and what the benefit, why it matters also, I guess. Uh, so we've, I have to admit that we have a hard time getting that information from your reports right now. We get hints of benefit. We have a sense that there is something there. So quite often to get to those benefits we have in the report, we had either to go back to the facility, look at your website, try to find a new story, for example, that's about that benefit that you mentioned in your report. But yeah, please try to provide it in such a way that it's as much as possible, not just the int, but usable, so we can give you something that you can validate and maybe tweak a little bit, but that doesn't need to be completely rewritten. And at the same time, like I said, it gives us hints. So it's important for you. I know that Sylvain was mentioning earlier, tell your story. I think it goes a little bit to that because right now we see MSI sometimes having a hard time telling their story. And even finding information on your website is often quite difficult, especially when we try to get to impacts. Uh, we saw some MSIs where, yes, the information is there, but it's hidden in an annual report. So we know where to look for it a little bit, but at the same time, it's well hidden. So it's not bad practice to maybe try to, I don't know, have a web page on your website that's about your outcomes. And right now, that information is often already available. It's just spread around. So I want to keep 5 minutes at the end because I need to speak a little bit about the year three reports that we shared with all of you. But at the same time, now's your turn to provide feedback, ask questions about the KPIs, what I just said. Um, Here are some questions we may have for you specifically. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily need to be about that. The floor is open for your question, and I have my team also that can help me answer some of your questions, I guess, if they're too specific.
Thank you. Very clear. So I understand the benefit of having a page on impact and benefits within the websites. And I was wondering when you were talking about stakeholders and how to simplify the story. Um, I haven't had to report for CFI yet, but I find that a lot of the government agencies aren't clear about who we should write this story to. And to me, it makes a whole lot of a difference. If we're writing to the public or writing to the stakeholder, it's not the same story we tell. So is that clear in your reporting, or do you have different sections for this, or how do you see that?
Right now, I would say keep it to a level that's at least understandable. That's why I was saying, please try to avoid jargon or very technical terms. We've seen things in your report. It's fine, but at the same time, it's like, okay, wow, that's so technical. Even I don't understand what they're saying. So I would say try as much as possible. I understand what you mean by you're not talking necessarily to government the same way we would talk to general public, but I would say go to general public, and at least it gives us that story we can work with and go back to you. If we know this is not presented the proper way, we may try ourselves to tweak it, especially if it's comprehensive enough and we have a good idea of what the benefit is. I think we can tweak the language depending what's your audience. But at the same time, we'll go back to you if we think we need something a little bit different.
My question is, do you need both? And so should there be,
I
because
wasn't.
it's not the same
It's
public.
burden to me.
Yeah.
It's mostly because it's burden for you. If I'm asking you to tell the story two different ways, they it's just adding up. Yeah, burden on the MSIs, and I think this is not necessary. Like I said, it's getting that story first, and then we'll go back to you if we need it. Oh,
All right, thanks. Um, one of the things that one of the challenges I think is that many of the metrics that are traditionally reported, the KPIs and so on, are still very useful for a variety of other audiences. So you think about an individual scientist who needs to publish, who needs to demonstrate grants and so on for his or her academic reasons, right? Those still need to be produced. So one of the things that I actually found useful was when CFI adopted the DORA framework. And you didn't mention it in your talk, but I did what I found useful about that as we applied that to the research institute I used to lead, was that it enabled a framework to essentially house a whole series of metrics that related to very traditional research metrics, some that were non-traditional, for example, the development of methodologies or algorithms and so on, but are still useful, all the way up to the kinds of impact metrics at a high level, economic, social, etc., that are really more compelling to stakeholders and the public generally. So I'm just wondering if maybe framing it in that way, thinking about incorporating these impact stories more broadly in the DORA framework. Doesn't necessarily have to be the DORA framework, although I find that useful. And I think actually the Tri-Council broadly has adopted it. If that's not an effective way to create essentially a skeleton on which to record the various metrics that we all know are important for so many different audiences.
I have to admit that our report right now, and it's our reporting in general, we've tried to include the DORA principles right now in our applications, but I have to admit that our report are not there yet. We've tried a little bit, but at the same time, we don't want to suddenly change our reporting completely. We could tweak probably the instructions to remind people of that, which wouldn't be a bad idea. But at the same time, I would be very worried just suddenly changing the entire way we're asking the reports to be done. But we'll have that opportunity, I guess, next cycle. And it's something we should probably consider. Our regular reporting, I was talking about our project progress reports earlier. Right now, we're looking into, I guess, renewing our award management system. And it's certainly something we'll look into. We've been using the same reporting documents or questionnaire now for almost 13 years, 13 or 14. So it's time to review, but at the same time, we're always thinking, okay, at some point we'll change our system. So probably we should wait. But at the same time, the change in our system is always pushed back a little bit. So it's been dragging on, but yeah, it's certainly time for us to think about that.
Hi, Joanne Provençal from the Canadian Research Data Center Network. On your first question, I have two things to offer. One is that it's nice to see on the slide that you're using the RIPATHS framework, which was presented last year. I think that was last year, maybe the year before, but and I think that's important because the impact is in the sphere of interest and not in the sphere of control. And I think it's important to make that explicit. So thank you. We've been using that for 5 years, so I was really glad to see it presented last year. And then in terms of the most difficult KPI for me at CRDCN, and I wrote down a note when you had the table up of the outreach. I don't know who has 261 outreach KPIs, but for us it's challenging because that's in the part B, and one of them is, press releases, one of them is broadcasts, one of them is podcasts, like these kinds of things. A broadcast? I mean, unless you're being really liberal in how you're interpreting broadcast, that can be challenging for us because centrally we measure as much as we can, but everyone here in a university knows it's hard to even track what your own researchers are doing in your own university when it comes to outreach or media or anything like that. So for us to go across 44 institutions and try to get that, it would be nice if there was a little more flexibility, I think, in that output indicator that doesn't feel so old school broadcast. Like, do I have to be on CBC News to put like one in that box sort of thing?
Yeah. Thank you. I see Tomoka writing notes right now.
Hi, Michael Loings from TMIC here. First of all, I'm sorry that I'm 85% of your data user headache. But I think that Raises a really interesting question, especially in terms of kind of our earlier conversations today about data sovereignty. Some of what's happened to us in this cycle is because we host a bunch of free online tools for users, and then Google Analytics completely changed how they are returning data to us. So they might be worth considering something along the lines of kind of an agreed upon web analytics platform for all of the MSIs to kind of work with together, because there are some available for like nonprofit use. But I think, being dependent on this like foreign third party to give us that data is going to make that data very messy. Okay.
Yeah, I can't say much about data user. As I said, it's certainly a challenge for us. At the same time, we don't know the details really of what you're collecting and how you're collecting it. So we count on you to do it in a way that makes sense for you, basically. But yeah, it certainly creates a challenge for us in terms of reporting later on. Any other question? So, so I have a question for you then. The first there, which is the KPI that's most challenging for you? I've heard at least one comment so far about this, but is there one that is very difficult for you to collect and report on? Because we've heard all sorts of things about our KPIs, and I know that for some of the facilities, especially those in the field of the SSH, they have difficulties with some of our KPIs, and I recognize that. But at the same time, are there any comments about those KPIs? I see Jody, and she's not SSH, but
I'm not SSH, but it inspired me to think about this last year you changed your KPIs on us and moved some around. And one of the things that you asked for was lines of code. And this in our community, like this just drove us crazy because it's not a metric that we use. And putting 0 in really, like it's not representative. Like we are coding all the time and writing code, and like like capturing this would be an enormous chore for us, and it's just not something that our community uses in order to measure the impact that we're having. It's like it would be like, I don't know, almost like taking out your notebook and give us all the scribbles that you have put in your notebook and handed in. It's something you have to do in order to make the science happen. And we struggled with this a lot because in the end, I think our program manager had said we could just say that this isn't a metric that our community uses, but it still really sat wrong because it felt like we were saying that scientists don't actually code when they code every single day.
I get that. At the same time, I can't say I remember exactly why that was added, but it probably was because one or two MSIs were doing that and were counting it. Um, at the same time, look, I want to emphasize that those reports, they're mostly for us. Yes, we report to the outside world, but when we report to the outside world, usually the questions are about, I guess, the regular or typical stuff. So they'll ask you about the users, they'll ask you about the trainees, they'll ask you maybe about the tech transfer. But getting to lines of codes, I think you're comfortable putting 0. And look, you have the ability also in part A, where it's more qualitative, where you provide narrative to say something like that. But at the same time, we won't hold it against any MSI to put a 0 somewhere. That's fine, and we deal with that. Like I said, this report in the end, it's us. I know it goes to our SAC committees, but at the same time, I don't think that any SAC committee or the review committees will look at it and say, how come you're not coding? So, and if you're uncomfortable with that, again, put it in your part A. So at least those expert reviewers, they'll read it and they'll say, okay, they reported 0, but they still do A. That would be my way of interpreting that line that we may have added.
Yeah, so I'm SSH, and my comment would be a little bit on the line of the DORA principle issue, and I was wondering, the KPI that would be challenging for us is technical transfer. It's very much I don't know, industry oriented. And it doesn't really, what I could say is that maybe it would be, I was wondering if CFI would consider more open science like principles or way of understanding impact in the KPIs. And for instance, in our case, we have open source. We use open source software, and so it has a big impact, and it has proliferating effect on our community because it require their involvement, so it's part of outreach and everything. So, but it's really hard. Like, there's no place for us to. I mean, we can write in the part A, but it's true that it feels a bit hard to just have no place in the So
at the same time, I know that if you look at the previous cycle to the present cycle, I know we remove within the KPIs the ability to add others, because that was causing all sorts of issues for us, because then MSIs could add different aspects. That the issue we were having with that is, even this was bringing in crazy outliers. Suddenly they were reporting 500 of something while everything else was 1 or 2. And was a little bit difficult to understand necessarily, okay, how come this you have 500, but the others you have 1 or 2? And at the same time, what it was introducing was also a bias of definition from one MSI to the other. Because if you're adding something under other, the other MSIs, they don't know you have added that, and maybe they could, but they don't know. And then it becomes an issue for us, because the KPIs are not reported kind of the same way across all the MSIs, which was an issue. We tried to deal with that, so we tried to adjust. We used the other that we had seen in the past to try to adjust a little bit, which we're collecting at least the subcategories that appear under the KPIs. But for sure, we couldn't accommodate everyone. So it's like, yeah, if you have something, you can talk to us for sure. And like I said, we'll need to consider, but that probably won't come before the next cycle. But we'll need to consider the DORA principles a little bit more next time. And I guess it's up to us to engage a discussion with the MSIs to try to come up with the best way to get that data. But right now, I would say, yeah, use the narrative to explain your position.
thank you.
Because it's okay reporting. I've seen and I've recommended to MSIs in the past, look, technology transfer, you're not doing it. Put 0. For me, it makes no difference. But explain, maybe you're doing something that's, in a sense, tech transfer, but which wouldn't be a patent, which wouldn't be a license or anything like that, but explain it then. And I know we've offered that possibility before. So as there is no other question, I'll go to my final piece of the presentation, I would say. So you've all received by now your report year 3. Jody was mentioning the addition of lines of code. So we've made, again, some changes to our MSI report. We're trying to avoid as much as possible those changes, but they often come from basically requests we've got. So part A, I guess we've introduced little details here and there in the instructions to try to clarify some of the things we're asking. And at the same time, one of the things that was added to the instruction is, especially when you're talking about impact, talking about success stories, don't hesitate to put a website link. Like I said, we've had sometimes to look at your website to try to complement the story you told in your annual or final report. If that was directly in the report you provide us with, that would be super helpful, because then we don't need to search your website. So that would be great. Part B, so the KPIs, there's 2 extra tabs that were added. I'm sure there will be reaction to some of them. But at the same time, international user, we were already asking about top, I think, Tomoka. Yes, I'm right. Yeah, so we were asking about the top countries where your users were coming from for international users. Now we consider that if you're able to report on that, you probably have the full list. So why not report to us the full list? So that's basically what it is now. So it's a separate tab, and as much as possible, try to provide us with the full list of where your users are coming from. This is a little bit in relation to our international strategy right now that CFI has developed. And at the same time, for sure, that brings an interest for the CFI in terms of having more internet data on international users or links. So we've been collecting through PPR more detailed information, and we would like to be at the same level with MSIs, because we often get requests, okay, where government is meeting with representative of country X this week. They would like to have a sense of how CFI has been supporting research also with those countries. And MSIs right now, we often need to leave out of any details we're providing like that.
If I may quickly, I'm Heidi Ibrahim from the Advanced Laser Light Source. Because this line of code question just made me back looking into it. And it was written like databases, code, or software. So I guess one thing that could be important is to measure the KPIs in a uniform way across infrastructures as much as possible. Like questions, for example, the way I interpreted this line was whether we put anything on GitHub or made any software development open access to others, and not the programs we are writing internally. But I think everybody has their own interpretation on how what you mean by it. So it would be really helpful to have this in a clarified way. Also for users, for example, how are users measured? Like if one person comes multiple times per year, I count them as one user, but I'm not sure if every infrastructure does this. Or is it a difference whether they stay 1 day or 5 months in our lab to do their experiments? So I think this could also for you in the end help to have like uniform and comparable numbers across the infrastructures. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. Duplication of users, sometimes it's or HQP is very difficult for some, because the way, I know that the way the data is collected by some facility is simply going to the different PIs that are associated with the MSI and ask them how many students this year. But then there could be maybe duplication, and it's the same thing, especially for users, because when one collaborator that they report may be the same that another researcher has reported. So in a sense, depending on how the data is collected, yes, there would be duplication sometimes. I can understand that. And we've dealt with that. We often have a note in report we prepare that this doesn't account necessarily for possibility of duplication. But yes, would be great if you could avoid. And I would hope that most of you try whenever possible to avoid duplication in your numbers, but I don't know if it's really a fact. So the last thing or the last extra tab we added, it's about additional details on technology transfer. So there was a little bit of talk about technology transfer, and in our regular reporting, so capital funding, we have or have been asking details now for many, many years on patents granted. For example, what's the patent number? We've done research on those patent numbers that have been provided sometimes to try to get a sense. Okay, yes, patents are related to our infrastructure, but around what area, for example, because there are specific categories for patents. So we've done some work, and we're hoping that MSIs will be able, as much as possible, to report to us on different, I guess, items related to patents. Same thing for licenses, and same thing for spin-off. I know that recently we got at least, it wasn't a question, it was a question about could you report in the future on this thing, which was what happens to spin-offs after 5 years. And we said, okay, but to do that, it's a lot of work first, but you need the name of the spin-off, because if all you get is a number, there's no way we can do anything with that in terms of seeing if those spin-off last. So as much as possible, if you're able to give us that extra detail that we're requesting on the tab, that would be super useful for us. And again, it's trying to bring MSIs to the same basis as our other capital projects that report to us.